So basically, I want to say welcome to the seminar this morning or afternoon as we approach afternoon. And thank you for being here. This is a seminar to address the transition, as Bromley so eloquently put it during the sermon earlier today. So that gives you a sense of it if you were in the sermon. And my name is Kristen Larson. I'm a member of the seminar committee. And I want to introduce two members of the transition team. We have the church moderator, Jeremy Archer, and the moderator-elect, Lindsay Teal, who are going to be talking with us. If there's anyone else from the transition team who happen to be here right now, can you please stand so we can recognize you? I think that's important. Okay, well, thank you so much. This is an important time in the church, and thank you all for coming. And as I stated earlier, the microphone is for those on Zoom. So we will just project, although I believe that, yeah, we will be projecting. So with that said, I will turn it over to Jeremy.
Okay, well, thanks very much for being here. This is the third in our series of seminars on the transition. This one's going to be a little more nuts and bolts, and the discussion is going to be a little more focused. So Lindsay will start by presenting the survey results so far. Then I will go through some of the potential future paths we might take. And then we'll have a discussion and kind of exploration of what those paths might mean. So if you can save comments and questions till after we've gone through the presentation, there'll be plenty of time to speak and say what's on your mind. And thanks again for being here. I'll start getting out some more chairs as well.
Okay. All right. Can you go to the next slide for me? Or do I have a clicker? Okay, perfect. I'll do that. The down button. All right. Maybe. There we go. All right. Oh, wow. Try not to break the technology, which I have a knack for doing. So the transition team put together the survey and a little bit of information about kind of the idea behind the survey. We recognize that this was not the most ideal time to be going through a process where we need to gather information over the summer, where a lot of folks are on vacation and not around. And so the survey really was to try to gather just your general sense of how people feel and what people are hoping for and worried about in the process of this transition. So we had 229 paper and online surveys, which was a phenomenal response. It's still open. So if someone mentions they wanted to get in and do it, they still can. It'll be there open and I can check it every so often. Just a couple things about the demographics of the survey. We asked if folks had returned to their pre-pandemic level of involvement, and it was a near even split of thirds. So about a third of people feel like they're back to normal, a third of people feel like they're almost there, and a third of people feel like they're not at all as engaged as they used to be. In terms of the UCG membership, we were able to capture 12 folks that had been here less than a year, so some of our newer members. 28 folks who had been members for 1 to 5 years. And then it increases as you go through the membership. So 102 of us have been here 16 plus years. And so that's pretty stratified, I think, for the demographic of the church overall. In terms of age, we felt like it was representative of the membership. We had 56 folks that were below age 54. And we worked really hard to make sure we were catching some of the parents and people with kids, so we were getting their voices. And then 165 over age 55. And then again, related to the youth, we wanted to make sure that people who have children that are actively involved right now in United Tribes or the middle school group or the high school group, that we were capturing their voices. So 125 of the folks that responded indicated they currently have or previously have had some involvement with the youth groups. So overall, we felt like we got a pretty good sample of some of the different folks that might be coming to church for different reasons. It's down, but only if I hold it the right way. Whoop. I hit too many buttons. There we go. Okay, so one more. Okay. This was the slider bar question if you took the survey on the phone or on the computer. And it asked people to indicate how important each of these different things is to their experience of UCG. And you could slide it from 0, meaning not at all important, up to 5, meaning extremely important. And so I want to highlight the ones that came out sort of on top. The ones in red are the ones that came out on top. So with an average of 4.16, the worship experience overall. At 4, the worship experience and seminars. Sermons, sorry, not seminars. I was jumping down looking for my next one. Hiding under there somewhere is fellowship, which is above 4 as well. And then learning about and participating in social justice work. So in general, being together, having a great worship experience, and being involved in social justice work are the things that people most feel connected to here at the church. The one in green is youth programs. It's lower, it's 2.84 as the average. I wanted to highlight though, the variance. So a little math nerding for a moment. When you do any kind of survey, variance is how much people disagreed on that particular thing. So your answers are kind of all over the place. So the higher the variance, the more your answers were all over. And that makes sense for the youth programs because a lot of folks cared about it a whole bunch, probably because they have kids in the program. And for a lot of folks, that's not the biggest draw for them in coming to UCG. So I just wanted to make sure I highlight that it was super important to the folks who have kids involved in the programs. So what does this tell us? I mean, this isn't earth-shattering news, right? People come to church for worship. People come to church to congregate. I think what's really important, though, is there's a lot of different moving parts in this transition right now. And I think it helps to keep our eyes on what everybody really feels brings them here the most. And as we start talking about staffing models, this, I think, can be what kind of grounds us. So whatever staffing model we end up with, are we able to provide these things for people, right? It doesn't mean that the other stuff isn't important. You can see that it is for a lot of people. But that if we definitely don't hit these marks, a lot of people are not going to feel like they're getting the experience they need from UCG. So as we move into talking about the staffing models, that's sort of what we're keeping in mind. And then all of that wonderful comments that people made, we did read through each and every one. Being impatient again. Thank you. Both Barbara and I and a number of the other transition team members. And we kind of tried to encapsulate overall, what did people seem to be having some common ground over? So on that question of what's your ideal vision a year from now, there's a general preference for one service. It's not, 90-10%, but a general preference towards the one service. Largely because people commented that the intergenerational connections and that feeling of a full service sort of met that need for fellowship and congregation. There were also a lot of people that commented that they don't want the idea of 2 services to go away forever, and that they would hope we would, if we chose to do one service, it would be something we'd re-examine again in the future if and when a second service was needed. In general, lots and lots and lots of comments about needing to manage the workload of the ministers. So lots of recognition that we don't want to burn our ministers out. We don't want to expect more of them than 2 people can reasonably do. There's some variation in how we solve that problem. So some folks mentioned things like the staffing structure, and then that has some varieties as well. Some folks mentioned things like programmatic changes or just daily duties, things like, do the ministers need to go to all the board meetings? So there were lots of different ideas about how we get there, but we all have a general consensus that we got to keep an eye on what we're asking them to do. A general preference for increasing our ministerial staff beyond our 2 ministers. So again, kind of along those lines, a lot of folks felt that it was important to do something different to bring them help. Now, there was a lot of variety in that. So I can break down the data in more detail of how many people said 3 ministers and how many said 2 with the part-time and how many said 2 with a half-time. So lots of variety in that. But again, just a general consensus that if we want to keep doing the work we're doing, they're probably going to need more help in some format. And then a general recognition of the need to closely monitor the finances and the budget. So a lot of people are aware that as we're having this conversation, we've got this, really annoying money thing in the background. Gets in the way of all the fun, doesn't it? And then the worst case scenario, the biggest one that jumped out, is a general feeling that we don't want to be having the same conversation a year from now, and we don't want to rush it. That's a hard balance. Right. You find just the line to walk on there. Sorry. This is what happens when you tabulate quickly moments before you come in to give the presentation. Yeah, we don't want the same congregation. No, actually, a lot of people wrote, we need a laugh. Actually, a lot of people did comment that they very much would like for things to be the same in that sense. But no, we won't have the same conversation. Thank you for catching my typo. And we don't want to rush it. So we have to have some discussion about what's that timeline that hits the mark for everybody, knowing that, it's going to feel a little fast for some of us and a little slow for others, but trying to find the best middle ground of what that looks like. Okay. I nerded out a lot on this survey. I have lots more data points if you're interested in them. I'm happy to share the nitty gritty breakdown, but that's kind of my summary as we move into giving you some context for the options that Jeremy's going to present. Right, I think you're next. Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. And Lindsay, Ann, and Barbara worked on that survey and put a lot of time and work into it. And I think 230 responses is phenomenal. So thanks to everyone who filled it out as well. So we've come to the nuts and bolts. There are more chairs over on this side of the room and more in the closet if folks who are standing get uncomfortable. So I'm going to go through the scenarios. We're going to talk a little about each one. There's going to be a comparison slide, and then we'll have some time for discussion about each one. And thanks also to Alan and the Board of Business who came up with some financial numbers for us to include. One of the early discussion points leading to this whole process was, hey, what can we afford now? Can we afford a third minister at this point in time? So we wanted to bring some actual financial projections to the discussion. So the kind of possibilities that we've winnowed down to out of, I'm sure, a wider range of possibilities are 2 ministers, which is continue with 2 full-time ministers and not any other ministerial staff. So the work that Chad and Alan in particular are doing would be temporary. And then when that's over, we'd find a way forward with 2 ministers. That's the first scenario. 2. The next 2+ is continue as we're doing now with 2 full-time ministers and part-time staff to address and do both some ministerial and non-ministerial work, which Chad, Ellen, and Heather are doing now. So continue that model permanently, if not the exact nature of the part-time folks. That's 2+. Okay. Next is hire a half-time minister. So we would have 3 ministers, one of them being half-time. We would not have half an actual minister. I've heard that doesn't work. But I'm calling it 2.5 for simplicity. And then the fourth scenario is hire a third full-time minister, returning to the number of FTE full-time equivalents that we've had in the past, roughly. And this would likely be a relatively young or new minister. So. Okay, and before I get into this, for comparison, this will be on a comparison slide. The total compensation, all the figures, the financial figure you're going to see is total compensation and benefits for ministers. Okay. It does not include program budgets, paying the bills of the church, that kind of thing. So it's salary and benefits for ministers. That's the cleanest thing that to be able to compare and really. Rob, did you have?
Likely relatively young new to the three minister scenario.
Let me address that when I get to that scenario in more detail. Okay, so and by comparison, up until Andy's retirement, that compensation figure was $368,000 annually. Okay, total benefits compensation. So that's the comparison figure. Okay, so 368,000, and this for three full time. Well, so
I need you to use the microphone because the people online can't hear it, and I think it's going to hold.
we're in general, yeah, the clarifications are okay, of course.
Bring over the mouth for that.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so two ministers scenario. So financially, the estimated annual compensation, understanding there's some inflation and things we can't control going forward. And this, Alan's given me a look here for this because I extrapolated this from one of the other scenarios he gave me. The annual comp would be about $253,000 or $114,000 less than previous, which is about, that difference is about 12% of our total budget. Okay. Programmatically, this would probably mean reduction in programming, both internal programming for church members and our outreach programming. It would mean a reduced capacity for worship and pastoral care, for ministerial time devoted to those. We think that it would probably mean a decline in church membership. And it would also have the highest likelihood of these scenarios of burnout for the ministers. Certainly challenge and dissatisfaction, difficulty doing their jobs, not necessarily being able to do the jobs they were called here to do or came here to do. So that's the kind of potential implications of this path. Carol.
Jeremy, when we look at Andy's salary, he was employed for 9 months, I believe. So his salary was not full-time. Annual salary was not for 12 months.
Thank you. Yes, it was I believe a 10-month contract, technically, but yes. Okay. So this is the two ministers plus part-time staff scenario, which would be a kind of a permanent version of what we're doing at this moment. The annual compensation would be about $300,000, which is about $68,000 less than we had been spending. Okay, that difference is 7% of the total budget. And again, these will all be laid out in a comparison chart shortly. Programmatically and kind of mission-wise, we would be able to maintain most of our current programs in outreach, though it's not clear we'd be able to maintain them all. It would still limit the capacity for our full-time ministers to devote attention to pastoral care and worship. I think the effect on church membership is unclear. I don't think that's easily predictable. There's a fairly high requirement for the ministers to spend time supervising and coordinating the more staff that we have. And then I think there would, this is not me, but the transition team in conversations with the ministers, there would still be a fairly significant or non-trivial likelihood of eventual burnout with this scenario. The hiring of a half-time minister and the financial model that was created uses a more experienced half-time minister and provides health insurance and benefits for that half-time position. So that annual expenditure would be $316,000 or about $52,000 less than what we had been spending, that difference being 5% of the total church budget. This would allow us to maintain and have probably some growth of programs and outreach. It would maintain our capacity for worship and pastoral care. But again, two and a half full-time equivalents, FTEs, is less than we had, okay? So it's not a scenario that would allow for tremendous growth in what we're doing, potentially.
When you are making this forecast,
Mhm.
I see you are thinking maybe in terms of time investment. So with the time of an additional half minister, you would be able to maintain or maybe grow the programs and outreach. However, there's also a budget trade-off whereby a full minister is gonna have to be paid. And in order to grow programs, we need even more money. So my question is, would that be sustainable to have, for example, 3 ministers and grow programs?
I'm going to ask you to come back with that when we have the discussion time. I mean, it's a great question. And again, to be clear, the finances are ministerial compensation and benefits only. I think we have very limited ability to predict the rest. But
You guys did the math or not, and probably not yet.
we don't have any math about program budget.
Exactly.
And I partly it's to keep the comparison cleaner, but partly it's because it's incredibly difficult to forecast. This would allow for essentially kind of maintenance, maybe some growth in programs. Effect on church membership, we hope, would be stability with some capacity for growth. And there would be less likelihood of burnout. And then the 3-minister scenario. So this was forecast financially in hiring a relatively young junior level minister as the 3rd minister, because we have 2 experienced ministers here already. And if you want to kind of extrapolate financially what it would mean if we hired a 3rd experienced minister, then it would probably be higher, almost certainly be higher than what we had been paying, because we had 3 experienced ministers, one of whom was on a 10-month contract. So that would be 3 probably on a full year contract, right? But if in the hiring of a 3rd full-time junior level minister, it's $354,000, $13,500 less than the previous, which is that difference being 1% of the total budget. So essentially we'd be returning more or less to what we had been spending. This would allow us to grow programs and outreach. This would increase the capacity for worship and pastoral care attention from the ministers and time devoted. This would allow us to grow the church membership. And this would have the lowest likelihood of dissatisfaction and burnout. So those are the 4 scenarios and our thoughts on where they might lead us. This slide is kind of a comparison of all that data. Data/predictions.
Let me ask real quick. I'm actually brand new to this whole budget.
Yeah.
Trying to understand everything. But I did the math looking across all your options, and for each minister, they're going to be getting paid roughly about $110,000 to $120,000. If you don't mind, since I'm brand new to the whole church thing, why do ministers need to be paid $115,000 per year?
So I'm gonna I guess that the financial projections and our salary model here is based on kind of market salary ranges for ministers. So I'm probably not the right person, and this is probably not the best forum to wonder why. I'm not saying it's not a legitimate or good question, but this discussion, I don't think we're going to be able to focus on that particular question. Yeah, that's yeah. So it's salary plus benefits, and actually I have the next slide is a breakdown of all that, so I can show that as well. So this is the comparison chart. Let me just briefly go to the next slide. And so this is the more specific budget breakdown for where all those pieces go. And this is the previous, I'm sorry, the font is so small, but this is the previous package. So 200 of that, 370,000, 260 for salaries, another 33,000 for retirement contributions, and fully 60,000 for health insurance. So that's part of it. Continuing aid, books, other business expenses make up the other piece. So let me come back. I'm not trying to ignore people who have their hand raised, but I'm going to go back up to this slide. And we're going to have some time to go through each different scenario and have folks talk about what they see as the pros and cons. Any kind of more clarification questions on this before we move on, Rob?
So could you explain the thinking that led to the forecasts of highly likely, moderately likely, unlikely, with respect to each of those programmatic implications? I'm particularly interested in the membership question. It's not readily apparent to me how those differences in budgeting result in such different forecasts of membership growth.
That's fair. So obviously this is quantitative data, but it's still prediction based upon current market values. It doesn't take inflation into account. This is completely qualitative and subjective. It's based on conversations with the ministers in particular about what the impact would be on them and their ability to do work. It's based on discussion among the transition team, conversations with folks in the congregation. But there's no systematic quantitative engine behind those predictions. Those are best guesses.
Just to amplify that question a little bit, I'd be interested in knowing what the assumptions were that went into drawing the conclusion that a certain staffing model would reduce in growing or shrinking the congregation. What's the causation that you guys are assuming? And the same for, well, I think the ministerial burnout is a little more obvious, but still, I think we ought to know what causal assumptions you all are making.
So in part, that goes back to that slide with the arrows that showed what are the highest priorities for people to feel engaged into the church. And so when we look at those specific things, something like developing a worship service, I don't think I'm not a minister, but the longer I've spent learning it, it's not a thing you sit down and write in like an hour and a half, it turns out. I didn't know. And so when we look at the things that people feel invested in UCG, and then we look at the time that would be available to devote to those things, to fostering fellowship, building the youth programs, writing really amazing dynamic worship services, that's how we started to extrapolate out and say, okay, if there's 2 people doing that work, and when we speak to the ministers and we ask, how sustainable is it to keep a certain level or even to raise that bar down the road? And so it's from those discussions that we were able to look at some of those high priority things and say, based on that, some of those things are maybe not going to look as dynamic or as good, or they're going to be stretched a little thinner. And then because we know that that matters a lot to people, if we don't deliver the same product, maybe people are going to leave. And we don't know for sure, right? We don't know. It is a guess. But those are the sort of thoughts we're trying to think ahead of, and consider what could happen. But that's where that line of thought came from.
I think there was, Michael, there's one more on that, and I'll add a little bit about the membership in a second too.
So I came in a little bit late, and I apologize if this has all been addressed, but so before, when Andy was here, we had a budget of 368,000?
370,000 roughly.
And were we hitting that budget, or were we falling short? And because, to me, it seems that the program is very good. It seems like things were working out with 3. And so then all of a sudden, if our plan is to cut back in any way, we probably would not be able to maintain what we've been doing. So it seems to me just inherently like we would probably want to have 3 full time. And I guess probably the tension there is that, COVID and a lot of different dynamics have played out that have caused budgets to come short. And so then you're having to compete with a smaller budget, or maybe we're saying that the inflation has caused salaries to expand, and now to be competitive and to be able to allow our ministers to live, we're having to increase this pot. But I guess it seems incomplete to just be talking about these numbers without all the other perspective of like, oh, are we going to have to, if we do 3, are we then going to have to cut other things? Or are we saying that we're not even able to fund the 3 that we once were? And so, this is going to be a stretch just to get back to the 1% down that we were projecting.
So, I mean, that's a great question. Partly it's incomplete intentionally. Okay. But the question about, yes, we were hitting the budget, but the last couple of years, that hitting the budget required substantial pledge increases year over year, far more so than we'd been averaging in the past. So I think we'd been on like 3% increase per year for a while. And that, that the last round was about 8% or so. So part of the question is, is that a sustainable? Can folks increase their pledge 8% year over year? And so that's part of the dynamic. That's really important question and a really important piece there. So, and it was a particularly bad year for inflation and expenses, and hopefully that that calms down for the church's sake and for everybody's sake. But that's what's behind that is maintaining the previous expenditure for at least a while would require pretty significant pledge increases. And so that's partly why Alan forecast hiring a junior minister in the 3rd slot. So we would come in a little bit under that. Okay. I'm kind of speaking for Alan, but I think that's part of the reason. But let's move on to the, go ahead.
Followed up on his, I was surprised that we didn't have the 3-minister option and potentially the option within that for a senior minister.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean when I see the numbers, I would be convinced that that's a good idea.
Okay.
But you cut the vision short that might be a consensus of the congregation by not addressing that. And I, for one, would like to see that, because what we're doing is paring down, for reasons I understand, paring down when I was hoping we might be figuring out how to go forward. And we're paring down at the ministerial staff, which are the highest rated items, when there could be other ways to pare down and fund it. And without having that table, I remain unconvinced that this is complete.
Okay.
Now, if I see the numbers, I might be totally persuaded that you guys made a good call, but I don't know that right now.
That's fair. I think it would be relatively easy to fill in the spreadsheet with that fifth scenario.
And the other option the other addendum to that is, let's not assume that we cut short our ministerial staff because of our budget needs. There are other things that we ought to be looking at that might have a role in it.
I think there are a couple other things that play into this. A lot of the rest of the budget is fixed costs in terms of paying the mortgage and the light bill and all that. We've had to take money from capital reserves almost every year and not add anything to it. And we're facing about $500,000 worth of repairs that need to be made on our building. And I really recommend all of you to read the Sustainability Task Force report. One of the issues we're facing as a church is the demographic profile is about 80% of the budget comes from people in their 65 and up. And as we age and perhaps move away to live closer to our children, or we're just not here anymore, then we don't have, the younger members aren't able to contribute at the level that the older members are. And so, there's a couple of other variables that make us a little more financially precarious, I think.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. All right, Ann, so Ann's going to kind of go through and facilitate a little more of a discussion on each scenario.
So we want to have sort of a more focused discussion on, I think some of this has laid the groundwork for the context of all of this, but we'd like to hear from you specifically on each of these scenarios, what your thoughts are. And so we thought we'd devote, we're getting a little long now, but let's take 5 minutes for each scenario and just hear some of your thoughts about that. So we'll start with the 2-minister, no staff model. Any thoughts on that approach? Kristen?
I just want to say I accept the qualitative part here as reasonable. It all seems very reasonable, and so if you accept that, clearly the first 3 options seem like we shouldn't do them. I mean, we want to do something that puts us in a position to be able to grow and prosper, and the only question is, can we afford it? And I agree with the comment that 2 years ago I was arguing for the senior minister. And I guess you could argue that our 2 ministers we have are now senior ministers, but I think that's still a valid point. So.
I'm wondering if there are resources from our national organizations, UCC, and my understanding is that we've had a consultant. And so I'm curious about some of that input as well. Is sometimes it's beyond control as far as our 2 current ministers. If something were to happen and we went down to 1, then, if we're already going at the lowest level option, where would we be? And I'm sure that there's other organizations and other UCC churches that have been through similar scenarios, and there must be some data for us to rely upon.
Yeah,
I guess we're diverging from the first out of 4 choices, but I think to extend that, we need to think about our ministers and And they're already stretched thinly, but they seem to be yearning, like the Vinery is a good example, for more to do. They really want to stretch themselves more, but they will feel impeded by that. In the first example especially, but like Daryl says, actually the first three.
And I guess I'd like to ask Jeremy or Lindsay. I've only come on the transition team lately as a representative from the Board of Human Resources. And I'd like them to address the question about the our consultant, because I've only come to that one seminar she led back in, I think it was Memorial Day weekend or something like that.
We do have a consultant. She was really involved with the more visioning aspect of things as we did in the last seminar, but our engagement with her has not ended. So part of what we're going to do is take the specific questions that have come from today, bring them to her. And so we are hoping to get some specifics on how other churches have handled and faced this in a more concrete way and specific to the finances, understanding that in a lot of ways we're a fairly unique church. So
Chair Board of Business, and the major source of money in our budget is member pledges. So any scenario, in my mind, any scenario that doesn't at least maintain or increase membership is kind of like a crazy thought to me. So if you want to stay where you are, you've got to keep people in the pews, if I may be so crass.
To answer your initial question, what is the thought on this column? And I think for me, unless we were in a financial situation like code red emergency where $114,000 was the difference between keeping the doors open and closed, to me, this is like not even on the table, because it's not even something we're doing right now. No, it's not something that any of us, I think, would want based on the potential outcomes.
I'm jumping to the next column as well. To the 2 and the 2 plus, I think the 2 plus, as I understand it, is working. It's a patch, right? But what we're not addressing with the patch is that we still have 2 key ministers who are stretched beyond what can be reasonably sustainable for any extended period of time. And I think, as you know, sort of employers, I guess it's a conversation we're having when we think about people who work with us and who do our work and who lead us. We want people who are renewed, who are engaged, who are feeling good about what they do. And we are very fortunate as a congregation to have 2 ministers who give it their all. You know, they put it on the line for everything and go beyond. And people like that, when you put them in positions of not being able to deliver their best, it doesn't feel good, and it actually hurts them, and they leave, right? Or they get burnt out. And I think that's a really important consideration to consider the dynamics of the people who we are asking to do the job, because again, even with the patch as we are now, we have ministers who are working 7 days a week. They are working through their Sabbath. They are working through additional stuff. They are here into the evenings. We are really requiring a lot of the 2 main ministers who, as was said earlier, they're both acting like main ministers, right? There's no, that hasn't shaken out that way. So I just want us to remember that in that decision, that what we decide is setting up the environment for the people that we work with and that bring us to worship, and that hopefully lead us to where we want to be as a congregation and as individual congregants.
I'm not sure if this like totally applies to, this column, but just, I guess, for consideration for like kind of all of them. Like, I was just thinking, besides what's been said, like money wise, it seems like, well, yeah, like get another pastor, like, unless we can't, like, you know, and something we hadn't at least been brought up is that a third pastor, like we've been at like another like church that was really big. And like, I remember each pastor like kind of brought their own people in a way, like, and I feel like that hasn't been addressed. And like that another pastor up there, like, not only will they bring new ideas to the table and like can grow all the other, you know, like some of the outreach and such, but like people in the congregation like might connect more to one pastor than another. And so a third pastor, I feel like, is a no-brainer, is going to grow membership, because like, you know, someone could come one day and you hear one pastor speak, and like, to be honest, you might be like, and then, but then the next pastor, you're like, oh, that's great. Like, not but you know what I mean? Like, that like we have different ways of like connecting, and like that might look different for each pastor, you know? And like, I don't know, that's just like, I just feel like, yeah, third pastor is gonna bring more people and like more people to stay. So that's just, I love all the pastors.
So I'm a part of the 2+ helpers scenario, and I heartily concur with what has been said about it's being a Band-Aid approach that is not sustainable. And I think we should take it off the table. We have 2 ministers now who both of them have worked when they were ill because there were no alternatives. Both of them have worked on their vacations because the work needed to get done. And I don't think that's what we want to ask of our ministers. They are working too hard now. Let me tell you, they are working too hard. There is a lot of talent in this church, and I think one way that we could take either the 2.5 or the 3 minister scenario and make it possible for us to grow is if we allow some of the members of this congregation who have special skills that are useful to the church to treat those as in-kind donations to the church, and, you know, basically work for a tax break, essentially, or as a donation to UCG, which is something, my work is very few hours, and that's something that I would be willing to do. I think there are others in this congregation who have skills that are needed that they would be willing to do. It would require additional managerial time in either the 2.5 or the 3 scenario, but it might well pay off in terms of growing our capacities.
Bill and I have been here since 1975, when there were about 50 of us. And we've experienced the growth and the importance of a good ministerial staff. And especially, I want to support what's already been said here, particularly what Heather said about coordination of volunteers. Since I was a volunteer coordinator, it's going to take someone to coordinate all the additional volunteer staff as well. And I think that we have grown because of the fact that we have attracted good ministers, and they have then brought and resonated with different people, and they've attracted new members of this church. So I think we really have to look at, you know, what can we do to keep 3 ministers? And the comment about the qualifications of the third minister, when you think about it, Andy grew with us. We've had other ministers that were new ministers, and they stayed with us and developed and gave us more contributions to this community. So I'm here to say, let's raise the money and keep the 3 ministers.
Additional thoughts on any of the models?
I was thinking, I mean, what I hear that a lot of people prefer to not cut on the ministerial part, but then it's very hard to make a decision or say something without seeing the full budget. And what are all the activities that we are doing? How much do they cost? And is there any place where we could maybe streamline or change that part?
Who is next?
There are a number of things which I'm sure the transition team has already gone through. Oh, actually, it might be totally irrelevant for you, isn't it? Yeah. So one of the things we are coming out of the COVID era, and I was, my experience, personal experience is kind of reflective of that. So the reason that we went from one service to two service during the year was because we could not physically accommodate the membership. Now, we have gone from two service to one service partly during the COVID times or recovering from it, but it seems to give you the impression that churches may be shrinking. Now, what the church is actually doing is having a multi-layer service in which there is Zoom and then there is all those things. So the real physical need for for space is going through a transformation at the same time. And we are accommodating that by having only one service. But let me guarantee you that there are perceptions which matter when the projections have to be made for increase or decrease in the membership. And that's the budget reflects inflation, it reflects the membership, level of membership, it reflects prosperity rise of the membership. And that's a term that please don't ask me to elaborate on. But anyway, so all of these things, I hope that you have actually, or you will keep in mind as intangibles, if you like, and so we have to decide on what we are doing right now. How is the membership doing in time, and how do we respond to the needs of the church?
I favor either one of the 2.5 or 3 ministerial models. For this reason, our world is changing very, very rapidly. As we come out of COVID, I'm becoming aware of that. And I think bringing in a young person, a dynamic person who is aware of the changing world that we live in would help us would help the other 2 ministers in leading the congregation to the next stage.
So I have a question regarding the differences between a 2.5 minister, so a half-time minister, and a full-time minister. Would the part-time minister also be a junior minister?
For the half-time position.
And would that be somebody within the community, or would we be asking someone to relocate to Gainesville, but only work part-time?
Well, we would do a search, and I don't think we would limit it to Gainesville.
quick double dip. I really liked what you said, is it, Amanda, about if we could, I know it's tricky, but if you could structure the ministers to some constituency, like this, I'm the social justice minister and I'm the compassion and relationships and self-actualization minister, and I'm the minister for agnostic. You know, that would, we could get more people that way. So.
Oh, Andy did social justice, and, you know, so that's kind of being spread around. And Brandon?
Yeah, so as a very literal minded person, I was kind of waiting for you to say, okay, now let's go to the column number 2. Let's go to column number 3. Let's go to column number 4, since that's how this started. But it's obviously evolved. Yes. I just wanted to put my 2 cents in to say that for me, the 2.5 or 3 are the 2 options that we probably should be looking at here. And for me, the biggest difference is whether the congregation would prefer a experienced minister or a new minister. More than anything else, that to me is the big difference here. What the congregation specifically is looking for in that area. However, for me, the big question marks then become, who is going to want to move to okay, so my day job is at the University of Florida, and we're having real problems in a lot of sectors of people wanting to move to Florida right now. And I could imagine that being really challenging for either of those 2 columns. And then I guess the bigger question is there a way to do a search that keeps both of those options on the table as we talk, as we put the net out there? Like, I genuinely don't know if that's a possibility.
Yeah.
I think one thing you said in an email to those of us on the transition team is one of the comments that was on a lot of the surveys is we need to clone Vince.
So I think I just wanted to mention, and we've talked about this, that it might be very difficult to find a good halftime minister. It's especially being in Florida, and even a full-time minister might be a challenge. So if we're up for that, it's fine. But I just wanted to say that it is halftime ministers, really good halftime ministers are hard to find. And that was from the ministerial staff. That's from other people that are experienced with this. So that's just something we should keep in mind.
I'd like to suggest that option 3, or the third, the 3 ministers, that we identify an A and a B, a younger, and maybe that's not the appropriate term, but a young professional minister versus, there you go, and a more senior one. Because in the case of developing ministers, it seems to me we need a mentor or mentors. And if that isn't available, I'm not sure we can expect that everything turns out rosy. So you could have an A and B, you could develop the numbers. I think it would address all of the different opinions, and you could also see the impact from a budget point of view. But with a new minister that is more youthful, my question is, what are they doing? What is their area, and who's mentoring that minister to grow? And if I'm not convinced that that's really going to work well, then I might lean towards the more senior, as long as I felt the money would work. But I'd like to encourage a focus on that so we can address the different options and the financial repercussions, so that those of us that we're hoping to see 3 and we see the financial impacts can certainly appreciate what you guys, I know, have spent a long time researching.
Address the mentorship part. We'll develop the financial model for the experienced full-time minister. That we can do that. We'll present that to you. It's a great idea. Thank you.
to listen mostly, so excuse me, but I did want to jump in and say this is the first time I've been considered an old minister. So thank you. Thank you. That's an important milestone in clergywoman's life. But it is. You're like young until you're old. But I would say that Talia, through her work with the conference and in other congregations, has done some significant mentorship, and particularly of our own Shelby Hall here, who is now a doctoral student. And in my last church, I supervised interns from the Divinity School at the University of Chicago and worked there for a long time. So you actually have among you some ministers with some experience in mentoring new ministers. So that's not something we necessarily have to look elsewhere for. We also have two fairly active minister emeritus who have been really lovely in helping guide folks too.
Hello, I know I'm a lot younger than most of the audience here, but hopefully that'll put some. So one of the things that I really do want to bring up just after hearing, I haven't been here the whole time, I will say that. So if there was something mentioned about this, I apologize if this is redundant. But we do also have to keep in mind that there is a changing dynamic of who is coming in and out of our area with the laws changing and the things going on in Florida, whether this be new financial changes, whether it related to taxes, or if an increase of members were to happen. What kind of members would we be bringing in, and how would we have to facilitate those members? Because as things change, people need new things. And I know that because me and my family, we're leaving the state because of all of this stuff. So younger people are leaving. The younger ministers are leaving. The younger, more youthful people that we want to bring into this congregation are leaving. And so finding and understanding that the people that we may want to bring in may not be here. And the people we do bring in may require more needs than what we account for. That's all.
If everyone who's still got a comment could raise their hand, I just want to get a sense of where we're at, because we're going to, so these three, and then I think we'll move towards wrapping up.
So first, I want to say thank you to everyone who has been involved with this transition team and our current and past ministers. Firstly, I want to say I'm a proponent for the junior minister model, only because that I feel that you have the opportunity for them to grow with us versus us maybe moving more towards their ideology or theology, as it were. Have really appreciated that in the past. And that's pretty much it. I just wanted to mention I'm a proponent of that model. So.
Oh, I have a couple of comments. One, I remember back in that presentation about the need for all the money that we're going to have to keep our buildings and all these air conditioners. This one's going to be going out and that one's going to be going. It's like my head was beginning to spin with all this money that we're going to need to raise to keep our building like it needs to be. So, I know that in looking at the ministers, I'm in favor of the three, but in any case, we're going to need to look at ways to keep that chunk of money, raise that and go, and then have more money yet for the three. And I was part of a Zoom meeting several sermons ago, and there was a point made that I hadn't even thought of, but it's critical. And that is, we need to make sure that we have some male leadership. So in the years we say, we've got to have a woman sitting on the board to get that perspective. We need to foster the girls to become leaders. Well, at this point, it seems to me that we also need to foster positive male leadership in maybe the third minister.
one more, and I'm sorry, I forgot. Amanda.
Checked online, which I feel bad about. So I don't know if there's anybody left online. There's no, okay.
I really appreciated, I don't know your name, but her comment. Okay. What is it? Andrew, sorry. But because I feel like, because we used to live in this is probably getting very off topic, but we used to live in Gainesville. We moved away, came back. I don't even think a lot of like, and I know that saying the word young, like it's a spectrum here. But like people know of like UCG and its uniqueness of like, because there's a lot of people who don't like churches these days, right? And so, let alone in Florida, people don't even know, I think, like this kind of community exists here. And like, I agree, like being on board with like a newer ordained, which that doesn't mean that doesn't say anything about their age. They could be young, I don't know. But like, I think new ideas, like for reaching out to like, how do we reach out to the community of like, people who don't know like, oh, like this kind of place exists here, And I think sometimes like new can be like someone has more energy. Like, I mean, I work in healthcare and sometimes like, I would always think like the most senior people there were like, they have the most experience, true, but they're also the most burnt out versus the new ones like came in with like eager to learn and like eager to like get out there, So, and I know healthcare doesn't apply necessarily to here, but that idea of like sometimes, and like they're OT, like I'm an OT, they're like OTs younger than me. And like, they like are teaching me so much, And I think sometimes I would think, well, I've been an OT longer, but anyways, like, no, like they had like all these really great ideas and they're newer, And so that's a bit of a tangent of a comment, but.
Do we want to take one more? Travis, one more question or comment and.
Yeah, for the 3 full-time positions, but one of the reasons why is because also I think oftentimes a part-time position is often seen as temporary. So if we get someone part-time, they may not be here very long. We have to do this all over again.
Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for your participation. This has been really helpful to our team. We are going to listen. We've listened to all your comments. Barbara has been taking notes, and we also have it on record. And so we are going to have more listening sessions, and those will be mostly by Zoom, right? Or are we kind of trading? We're kind of, yeah.
At this point, we're for some evening times to give
Evening listening sessions. Right, for feedback. Also talk to any of us. Please stand again, transition team members, if anybody's left. So definitely we are working hard on this. We are actually having 2 meetings this week, one with the consultant and another kind of a power meeting. So we want to take all of your information into account, and your comments have been great. And it's given us a good place to move on and get into the next steps. So thank you so much.
Thank you.